Hi, my name's David Spring from Grant Thornton, and welcome to our latest podcast and Grant Thornton TV programme. Today, we are joined by Paul Whitfield, the CEO of the States of Guernsey, Elaine Gray, partner at Carey, Olsen, and also she's the president of the Guernsey's Chamber of Commerce, newly elected. Well done, Elaine.
Thank you.
And Laura Cornelius, who's head of HR for the International Stock Exchange in Guernsey, and our very own Susie Crowder, who's head of Human Capital Advisory. The subject for discussion today is work, life and play in a post-COVID environment. So, informal chat, over to the four of you, and I'll speak to you later.
Great, thanks David. And thanks hugely to our panellists of today's session, where we're going to reflect on what life now looks like in a post-COVID world, at least for the Bailiwick of Guernsey, thanks to the superb work that was done by the political and civil servant team across the Bailiwick. So just to kick things off, I thought it'd be really good to try to pose quite an open question to each of you around how the way we live, work and play in a post-COVID world, sort of what does that look like? How has life changed fundamentally? And I think, Elaine, if you could sort of perhaps share some of your perspectives to get the ball rolling, that would be great.
Yeah, well, thank you first of all for inviting me to be involved, particularly with such prestigious members on the panel. So in thinking about this in terms of the way that living and working and playing has changed, I think in terms of living, we've all come to appreciate our home environments much more, and actually to reassess what those home environments contain and how they should look like going forward, given how much time we had to spend in them and with our families, it has to be said, over the lockdown period. And I think what we're certainly hearing about is more and more on the employer side, people thinking about if they have to have employees working from home, is that setup ideal? How should they look at reconfiguring it? But actually on an individual basis, people starting to think about the things they value. So green space becomes so much more important. And we had quite a lot of people who were living in flats in lockdown and who really struggled with not being able to just step outside into a garden. In terms of working, huge change in the sense that it is much harder. There used to be, I think, in professional life especially, this culture of presenteeism. You know, you've got to be at your desk 9 till 5:30, and if you're out of the desk at 5:30, you're not committed, you're not enthusiastic, you're not really engaged with your employer. And I think people couldn't be seen, so it turned back to that really key thing of the trust and the relationship between employers and employees, which was critical. And just in terms of play, that's an interesting one, isn't it? Because none of us were allowed to go out and play together during lockdown, really, until the much later stages. And I think culturally, we are now much more focused on issues of risk and managing risk. That has brought with it, I think, some mental health challenges in terms of how people have been. And I think moving forward, given that COVID's not going to go away, managing that risk properly, assessing it, balancing it with all the other motivators for people, such as having the ability to socialise, having the ability to live normally, but maybe being able to manage those risks sensibly, whether that's distancing, masks or whatever, that's going to be a key part of life going forward.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And Paul, from a public sector perspective, what are your views on this, please?
Well, I think I'd echo a lot of what Elaine has said, and those that have worked with me or know me know that we've been on quite a considerable change and transformation journey for some time, and there's always a lot to do in that space. But what I've been trying to drive as a culture was in the organisation, and one has to constantly remind oneself when you're talking about the public sector, it's not an office of 80 people, it's 5,500 people that cover a huge and diverse range of work. So how do you get that to work harmoniously together is quite a challenge. But the starting point for me really was to try and establish a relations-based, values-based organisation which is easy to talk about, but far harder to actually put in place. And that sort of relationship-based organisation, I think, has really been enhanced and come to the fore. In the first order effect has been how the community has been seen to come together and work very much, I think, has suddenly sort of understood the other person. And I've seen that in the workplace, and I think that's been reflected in how we've managed to work far more collegiately as one organisation working together. So that sort of community ethos and spirit we've seen in the broader community has transferred itself into the workplace. There's a far greater understanding and tolerance for each other and realisation of the input. I think if I can put that a different way, haven't we seen how important people that put food on our shelves are and serve the food are? You know, in the same way, if I stretch that across, we talk a lot about nursing and public healthcare officials and the people that quite obviously keep us safe in managing COVID. But actually, has anybody noticed that our waste management continued all the way through? These guys were wearing PPE kit on top of PPE kit. They start at 4 in the morning. It's absolutely exhausting and hot conditions, but continue to do that. But I think what we've seen is a greater appreciation for what each other you know, what we complete to form part of our community.
Yeah, brilliant, brilliant. And finally, Laura, over to you, please, from a stock exchange perspective.
Yes, so first of all, I'd like to express my thanks for being invited to join this session as well. I guess from a stock exchange perspective, it is slightly different because we are a much smaller organisation to something like the States of Guernsey. We are only 35 staff members. We had remote working up until the point of COVID and lockdown, but it was very much on an ad hoc basis. So moving to working completely remotely was quite a change for us. But the way in which we adapted very quickly was really, really apparent in kind of our technology and how we could actually move everything to working remotely. And we didn't have a single individual who needed to go into the office throughout that whole period. Coming out of lockdown on the other side, we immediately established a remote working policy, and that was listening to the needs of our staff and actually really taking on board the successes that we had during lockdown and seeing that this can be taken forward in a positive way. I think kind of echoing Elaine's thoughts on the way that we live, what I've kind of heard throughout the business and kind of throughout the community is that there are actually some benefits that you saw to lockdown of actually being able to take daily exercise where you normally wouldn't have done, being able to actually really get outdoors and enjoy the beautiful island that we live on and being able to spend more time with your family. So I think those small things can be taken forward and hopefully aren't forgotten, and you can use them in your day-to-day life moving forward.
Yeah, brilliant.
If I could come there, I think that's such a good point. I think a lot of the learning experience in terms of well-being and workforce has come to the fore with people being able to do remote working, but also the time lost in traveling to work, traveling in between workplaces to attend meetings. And I've seen people I know, well, and I'm one that you know, you can afford to actually join and have a conversation if you choose to do so with someone at 7:30 in the morning. If you want to go for a swim because it's a beautiful high tide, we live in a fantastic place, and you want to go for a swim at 8 o'clock for 20 minutes, half an hour, you can be back on to another meeting at 8:30, and you've lost no more than you would have done driving to work or going in between meetings. So, and that has to be good for the well-being of people. You know, I always reflect, you know, why do a lot of people either return to Guernsey or choose to come and work in Guernsey? Well, you eradicate long commutes, you eradicate some of the exhaustion that you get when you work in a very large jurisdiction, and actually you optimize this sort of lived environment you work in alongside your workplace. I mean, what a fantastic opportunity.
I think coming on from that, well, what we've had in COVID is actually an experience that, as a shop window for the rest of the world, is fantastic, because the management of COVID was so strong, and the community spirit that you referred to was incredibly strong. And I do think there is a bit of a cultural shift happening there in terms of that recognition, as you rightly say, of the fact that, you know, individually in our own little spaces, we all need to do our job and all the rest of it. But actually, it was the understanding that we all have a part to play in that community, and that kind of reminder, not to take for granted the waste disposal, not to take for granted the police, not to take for granted nurses, and often, particularly, the lower paid jobs that are there in high numbers, which are not necessarily part of anybody's focus on a day-to-day basis, or weren't prior to COVID. So it's a lovely shift. And I do think there is a much more positive engagement generally within the community, and a more gracious, if you like, acceptance of the interoperability of people's lives. It's really, really nice to see.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly on a personal note, you know, when I was keeping all of my different plates spinning, trying to homeschool William, trying to keep the house tidy to avoid an argument with my husband, making sure the pets were all taken care of, you know, boy, did I appreciate, you know, our cleaners when they came back, and our nanny, you know, when she was able to start work again. It was, you know, a massive relief for me. And I think, yes, you're right. All those points, you know, we've all come to appreciate our beautiful island. And I think also Guernsey has been put on the map globally for the jurisdiction that managed COVID in a really successful way, and allowed the people in this jurisdiction to enjoy some of the benefits that many of the jurisdictions still today are not able to enjoy. So, yeah, thumbs up. Good learning. Okay, next question. Redefining the future of work. The future shape, size and location of the workforce and workplace has all been brought into question because of how wonderfully effective technology has allowed us to work. It's highlighted one or two different challenges along the way. So we've got, as we've already sort of touched on, people working in very small living accommodation that turn into their office, and you know, the whole life on a 24/7 basis. But I think, you know, that the role of technology has enabled us to think very differently about our organisational structure, its location, the size, and, you know, just sort of some statistics in there. Zoom saw an increase in users by 20-fold, as did MS Teams, who experienced an increase of almost 4-fold in March alone. Learning organisations such as FutureLearn experienced an additional 1 million users in the month of March alone, and I understand that's continuing even today. So I think it has provided, on an individual level, an opportunity for us to stop, reflect, and really think about what do we want to return back to. And on a corporate level, I think it's allowed the same sort of thing, but I'd be interested to hear your perspectives on that. What does the future of your organisation look like, having had this experience?
Well, if I could just start off there, Susie, there's something that Elaine mentioned about presenteeism, and actually there's this mantra, particularly the public sector, civil service, I think traditionally are very keen on policy and procedure and process, particularly around HR related policies, when people attend, how long they attend, rather than the real core focus on what are the outcomes an individual is achieving, what is their productivity. And that has to also come about on a really strong trust base. And I think we've, again, without over polishing it, I think we've really done well as a community. And a lot of that is, I can remember the very, very first weeks and thought, good Lord, I was there with Nikki Brink and Gavin and a couple of other lead officers, Mark Degare, and we thought, good Lord, we've got a huge problem facing us here. We were well planned because we'd actually desktop a pandemic for 6 weeks in November on data and information. So we felt we were in a strong position and we moved quite quickly. But we then said, look, we've got to communicate with our community. We're not going to get this right because we didn't really know what we were going into, and we're going to make mistakes. But hey, let's just be honest from the word go, and try and kind of girder that trust. And that might seem an obvious thing to say, but it's not always obvious working with government in your community. And we've worked hard to establish that. And I put that into my private life for a second. My youngest child is 16, and they started very early on. He's at Elizabeth College, and they were using online learning fairly quickly. And he had a program of attendance, and he had his timetable for the week. And in the very early days of lockdown, dear me, he was staying up really late and sleeping half the day. And I thought this was atrocious. And I was actually I was an individual who had to attend work an awful lot. And my wife is also in an essential job, so she was having to go out. And I was really worried because my 16-year-old was at home, and to all intents and purposes, seemed to be a lot of spending his time up late, communicating with his friends because they can, which was a good thing, but then was sleeping late. And I thought, oh, good Lord, I don't think he's probably attending any of these lessons, because they were longer lessons, but time intervals between them. So I did the real dad thing, and I contacted the school online and said, I'm really worried. I said, I have to apologize. I said, I'm completely immersed in work, and I'm sure my son probably isn't putting the shift in he should be with his classes. And he hadn't missed one.
Wow.
Now, and I think it goes back to this trust and this presenteeism. If actually people are actually operating, producing the goods, why are we so transfixed about where they're located in doing that? And I just think, for me, we haven't returned the entirety of our workforce back to States buildings. In fact, we've taken an absolute mission not to do that. We've got what we've called a regulated return to work, and that sounds a bit stiff and starchy, but the reason for it is going back to what Elaine said. Quite clearly, not everybody has enjoyment of a garden, and some people have very small accommodation with children on top of them, and that's not easy to work. People haven't always got the right equipment, and that can produce long-term problems for the employee and the employer, I would suggest. So we are actually looking at how we better accommodate. So I think we've run into it, and it's great to celebrate more remote working, more flexibility, but we also need to do that in a good way, supporting employees. So we're hopefully working alongside our workforce to say, look, we are working as to how we can better accommodate this. We're currently doing a pulse survey. We've done a couple of surveys. We surveyed all managers to say, did this work well? What didn't work well? What was hard to contact in terms of keeping your work going? But also we've done a pulse survey with our staff to say, what did it actually feel like? What worked well for you? Were you getting the contact that you felt you needed? Were you getting supervision still on a regular basis? So we're getting some really good feedback, and I think it's important that we build that into our thinking going forward, and just don't accept it that people can necessarily work from home. But it is incredible. It's incredible, you know. The States of Guernsey operate from over 100 different sites. Now, some of them are obvious. You've got a prison, you've got a hospital, and you've got schools. But still, even across the administrative state, for an island as small as ours, we're operating and using far too much estate. Well, that's power, that's energy, that's people traveling to those offices. that actually, put pollutants in the air, etc. So this isn't just about productivity and just the well-being. This can actually really shape opportunity for Guernsey to do things in a very, very different way.
Completely agree with that, Paul. I mean, it's so a number of sort of observations. We when we could reopen completely, we didn't want to force people to do that, so we gave people the option. And I think nobody wanted to stay at home, which we took as a good sign. And a big part of that was, I think, on the social level, the interactions with colleagues and the access to some of the equipment and such like. But for us, we found varying experiences in terms of the success. And for example, the legal staff, the lawyers, it was reasonably easy to work from home because you're working in documents, you're advising on calls and such like, so that's okay. But there were quite a lot of our support functions that couldn't so easily be done remotely. But the other aspect which we found was that some elements of our work are better done, more efficiently done, more effectively done together. And as a manager, for example, I've got a team of 25 people, so relatively small fry compared to you, Paul. But what I found was that it's actually quite hard, for example, to do a Zoom call or a team call and work your way around everybody individually. It takes quite a bit of time. Delegating work took time. But it could be done. So I think what we are seeing is that there is a shift to a much more blended approach. But like you, Paul, I think our concern is that you don't just willy-nilly go straight into let's all work from home or opening the doors to that without proper consideration. You've got issues to consider, such as the health and safety of the work environment. So we want to make sure people, aren't sitting at their kitchen table for 3 months and ending up with a bad back. We want to make sure the equipment's there. We want to make sure it's secure from a data perspective. There's those sorts of considerations. And I think coming out of this, one of the things, and I'm putting on my Chamber of Commerce hat now, is, I want to be working with the government to say, right, okay, we've got all of these properties in Guernsey. If we do try and facilitate remote working for all the very good reasons that you've said, Paul, such as the environmental, less traffic, less use of unnecessary use of premises and consumables, can we make our planning more flexible to facilitate home offices being built? Small changes in our infrastructure could enable Guernsey to be much better in terms of the ability to work from home and manage some of our resources. And in terms of the shape of the workforce, I'm flipping back now to my employment hat. We are seeing people rationalise their workforce and realising that instead perhaps of having one secretary for every 2 lawyers, actually, we can do that differently, but we want our secretaries to have different skills. So what we are starting to do is to look at that skills mix and to say, who have we got, and is this the right, well, not so much who have we got, but how can we help upskill the people that we have to deal with that new world in terms of how we go forward. I do think there is going to be a reduced use of buildings because we just opened a new office in St Paul's in London for our London office, which is now sitting gloriously empty and extremely expensive. And I don't see that changing going forward. But that is obviously going to have an impact on Guernsey PLC if that office space isn't as heavily utilised. What is it going to be used for? And again, that comes back to then planning. But I was interested from Laura's perspective, saying that, the stock exchange, your experience, people are quite happy and keen to do the work from home. How do you find it with the buildings and the infrastructure?
Yeah, so I think with the use of technology, we have seen some successes in remote working. So for example, we managed to recruit and onboard a member of staff completely remotely during lockdown, which is something that I didn't see was going to be possible up until the point in which we actually managed to go through that process. From the kind of marketing side, we conducted a lot of the meetings that we would have normally been having in London or other jurisdictions completely remotely, and they were still a success. So then that's looking in the future of, will there be less travel and will we be trying to reduce our footprint in that way? But I do think that what people do need to remember and take on board is that remote working is achievable when everyone is working remotely, but when you go to having 90% of your staff in the office and 10% working remotely, is that engagement then lost? And I think it's a very, very different situation to having everyone in the same remote working situation to having 1 or 2 people who aren't here in the office environment. I think that's something that we still need to see how that is going to work in practice, because it is fundamentally different.
Absolutely.
It's a good point. Actually orchestrating what seems to be an inordinate amount of gatherings at the moment because of where we are and what we're still dealing with. Actually, a day spent back to back on Teams, which is our chosen product, can be quite exhausting in itself, particularly if you're chairing and orchestrating meetings. That said, I think so. It is a blended mix. I don't think we should lose sight of the dynamics Laura has suggested in terms of team building, relationships, the sociality of going to work shouldn't be lost. Indeed, that in essence also puts something into the economy, because if you think of as town as our city, actually a lot of the sandwich bars, the coffee shops, the restaurants actually max out on people coming out of office blocks. So there's lots of impacts and consequences I think we need to consider in that. But nonetheless, certainly in my worked environment, we have to have a lot of our sort of equivalent formal board meetings. So a lot of those are political meetings, require attendance. So the team, if you're working with a particular political committee, and for me, obviously that's policy and resources a lot of the time, but we obviously might need colleagues from St James Chambers coming in to give legal advice on a specific issue. We might need someone from health or environment to come and give specific input, etc. We have people working in Brussels that we bring over, but from the Brussels office. Well, what we've done, and to combat some of the difficulties that we were just talking about, we're using large screen televisions that we've now put in our boardrooms, but also brought in far more high performance audio sound so that actually you can see everybody. But what we don't require is attendees at meetings so much. So someone from St James Chambers, which, you know, there's a cost and impact to all this, spending time, even Guernsey, in Guernsey space, nowhere's far, but it is when it comes down to leaving St James Chambers, getting your car, finding a parking space, attending that meeting. You know, the agenda item might be delayed, then you actually, working smartly, you can just call, as long as they're standby and they're in the lobby, someone can continue working at their desk or wherever they may be, and you call them in just when you're needed, and they leave when you, and that has to be a more effective way of working.
And Elaine, as you mentioned, the cost of office space is something to also take into consideration. Before I moved to Guernsey, I worked in London for a number of years, and a number of employers over there had already taken the step to having a reduced workforce in the office to simply reduce down costs. So that could be something that we see in the future over here.
Yeah, and I think that, and I see this, we're planning that we start our financial year on the 1st of July. So we've been doing all our planning and things like marketing activity. It's fair to say it's a rather different future for our business development and marketing activity than it used to be. But actually, I think that speaks more broadly than just the legal sector. So it seems very unlikely that we will be jumping on planes to the same extent that we used to do. And tech, in terms of meeting our contacts, our referrers in London, Geneva, wherever it happens to be, is a huge part. So we can see operational changes from that perspective. I do think that the shape of the workforce as well, and I know Grant Thornton has done quite a lot of research on this, the impact of automation, the impact of some of these tech solutions. So in the legal world, the ability to have dictation systems that mean your secretary, instead of plonking away on a keyboard, can do something more effective. He or she can be organising other elements and doing more of a paralegal role. I do think that the reports that are coming out are showing the impact of that automation and the use of AI across financial sector. For example, customer due diligence has long since been crying out for platforms to be used to automate that process. And I know there are various products coming through there. What worries me is that at the moment, I'm not sure, and I know, Paul, with Revive and Thrive, this is a part of it, and Susie with Futures and so on. A key thing from my perspective is we need to do that upscaling sooner rather than later, because we're at probably towards the worst of the dip. I don't say it's necessarily over, because there's still a lot to come through in figures, I suspect, on the unemployment stats as the situation shakes out. But, you know, if any time you want to plan, this is it, and to start the process of building the recovery.
I think those are really key points. And there is massive opportunity in there. I'll be cautious what I say, because no doubt I'll be shot if I reveal things I shouldn't reveal unless they've gone through the appropriate hoops. But here goes. The Revive and Thrive document is being well worked on, and that's important. And I think the focus is on the immediacy of what we can do around Revive, and we're talking about actions that would come this side of Christmas, real things that could have a community impact, and obviously grasping the really fantastic longer term opportunities that we can do for our jurisdiction, our island, in the Thrive element, in terms of growth, sustainability, the way we change things for the environment. So an awful lot of really fantastic work is happening, and we'll start to hear about those short-term initiatives very soon. But just to give you a flavour, while you were talking, Elaine, particularly, I thought little ticks were going off in my head, knowing where we're going. For example, actually, if you want people to work at home, maybe they don't want to work in their dining room table, and maybe they do, if they're fortunate to have space, build one of these lovely little garden offices that you can get now. But you don't want to spend 9 months getting planning permission so let's strip out the unnecessary bureaucracy, and I can tell you we're working exceedingly hard in how to do that. But you will also know that we took on Agilisis as a strategic partner. This is enabling me to really speed up our transformation, because I know, for example, working alongside the Committee for Development and Planning and the officers, I'm saying, right, let's actually get those digital sprints in. Let's automate planning. Let's get it online. Let's see the visuality, the planning permissions, all can happen so much quicker. Now, that is great for industry, but that's also great for people if they want to accommodate home working in a different way. But then I turn my mind to, part of our transformation journey, we've already taken the entirety of tax and put them into Frossard House. The entirety of Grange Road Education Headquarters is now in Frossard House. We'd started that journey. But actually, the application of the technologies we've seen, whether that actually be automation or remote working, allows that to take us to a completely different level. And I think we will see a drop in at least 10 to 11 core office sites from the public sector alone. Now, you then say, well, what does that do to accommodation and office accommodation in the town area? But actually, what a great opportunity to possibly repurpose some of that. Yeah. And we know affordable first-time housing for a lot of people. And what about the young people or young couples? Actually, our lives change. At one point, we want to be near town. We want a gym in the same building as we work. We want to get to the bars and the nighttime recreation. Later on in life, you have a family, you might have children, you want garden. It all changes, but we can possibly repurpose some of that into affordable living accommodation in where our high levels of employment are in the town area, again cutting down travel time and travel to work, which has, you know, multiple wins for our community. I think the importance about it is that actually we do take that learning and we put that, and all I would endorse is those are the sort of things we're seeing go into the Revive and Strive strategy, including things as how do we accommodate and make ease of access in terms of cost and access, learning type packages for people to reskill and catch up possibly where we are going with technology. And that's a bigger problem for me overseeing the public sector, because we know we're going to displace a lot of staff as we reduce our operating space, as we use more technology. So we've got to make, we mustn't forget, we've still got an aging demographic, and we need to optimize the skills and the potential we've got with those that can work and contribute and get the optimum we can out of the person rather than just the technology. So where do we really need people, and how do we skill them to have best work? So I think there's so much we can do. I find it really incredibly exciting. And you know, whilst no one would want COVID to come back or to happen in the first place, then from a really bad thing, let's optimize. And we mustn't forget, people have been lost on Guernsey, and I wouldn't want to detract from that for 1 second. But actually, for that loss, let's actually really achieve on behalf of those people a better place to work, rest and play.
Such a strong thing, isn't it? I mean, I completely agree with what you're saying there, Paul. And I think we saw it in the litigation, the legal space. The court started a move, was forced to move through the COVID to virtual hearings, and we've streamlined so much. And but for COVID, that probably would have taken a much longer period of time, and we're loving it. It's great to see that change, and you're right, out of adversity comes opportunity, and we absolutely have that there. And you know, well done actually, as a Guernsey taxpayer on the initiatives that are there and that are happening. I think I wanted to come back to one of the points that you were talking about before, and I think one of the shifts I'd like to see, and I think we are seeing it, and it's been a wonderful experience working with our employees, because actually you're kind of humbled as a manager, because you realise that actually an employer's organisation is a living, breathing thing, but so much about it is there's the two sides to the coin. On the one side, there is trusting your employees, and on the other side is accountability, both you to them and them to you. And out of COVID, I think our sense is that coin, you know, it's just become much more sharply focused for us. We trusted everybody to go home and do their best, and they more than did that. And I think just as a learning experience going forward to the future shape of the workplace, I do think that trust dynamic is even more critical. But the flip side of it is the accountability piece. And I think as leaders of organisations, you need to make sure people are equipped to deal with that accountability piece. And that means making people comfortable with having those discussions when somebody isn't actually working from home, they are sunning themselves in the garden or down the beach or whatever. So having the courage to call out, and I think we've seen that within the community, that there is a much stronger sense of accountability, and also that recognition of humanity. Right at the very outset, Paul, you were talking about the leadership team, the CCA, civil contingencies dealing with this, and the recognition that there is no roadmap. You won't always get it right, but you'll put your hand up and say when you get it wrong, and you learn from it and move on. And I think that's one of the single biggest tangibles that came out of the way that this was dealt with at a governmental level, and it's provided a lot of leadership role model in terms of the business community too.
Brilliant. We're just now going to move on to the third area of today's session. So the shifting seesaw of work-life balance in a modern world. So when we look at some of the data that was collected during the lockdown period, we noticed that the I guess the impact on people's well-being was significant, although by sharp contrast, the number of recorded absences that were recorded dramatically dropped, and now people are slowly but surely creeping back into the workplace in one way, shape or form. It seems to be back on the rise again. We did Grant Thornton did a huge amount of research on the impact and well-being, and we continue to do it, but I often hear on a very human level people saying lockdown was great, you know, it gave me time to think and reflect and, you know, to reassess and reevaluate where I spend my time, with whom I spend my time, and so on and so forth. And it was great, but you know what, I promised myself during lockdown I wouldn't jump straight back on the hamster wheel again, and here I am a couple of weeks in and I'm straight back on it. How does that bear with you? Do you think we will see a better shift in work-life balance, or do you think we will just go back to how we were?
I think for me, we've got two responsibilities here. I think the recovery strategy, or Revive and Thrive, can do an awful lot in terms of it. Absolutely, we have to have a really strong thread of the economy throughout that. We know we need to have a strong economy to provide the services that we need, etc., etc. But we mustn't, and I'm certainly determined, as far as I can influence and input, that we grasp, and that's why they're a core element of Revive and Thrive, is based around community and health. And health isn't the hospital. Hospital just happens to be a component part of health. Health is the whole well-being of us all. And the community is a sense of how we really capture what was good during that period. I think you're absolutely right, Susie. People reflected what was, you know, people just went out walking, didn't they? And you saw more families out at the weekends, which was fantastic. And, you know, people become better connected. People have said, actually, using technology, one of the feedbacks we've got, which is quite surprising, and it's a slight contradiction to what we've said about people want to come back into the office. Quite a lot of people, of our staff, have actually said they felt better connected during the time they were working home, because they were actually just catching up with people and just hooking in on a Teams call, you know, for 5 minutes, 10. It didn't necessarily mean it was just work related, but they were checking in with colleagues that they weren't physically seeing. So, you know, I think that's a real opportunity. I also think I've got to be really careful how I phrase this on the dawn of our discrimination legislation, etc. But this is a slightly ageist thing. I think what's really shone out for me is a bit of a catch-up in society of the value and merits of technology. And I've seen for a long time and got frustrated that young people come into the workplace and they live their lives surrounded by their own personal choice of technology, and they live their lives centered around that. I've seen that with my own children, how they communicate, how they socialize, how they purchase, all those sort of things. And then we get them to come into the workplace and ask them to adopt really quite draconian processes, etc., how we work. Who would have ever thought that we delivered, this is really interesting, we delivered in 3 weeks, 2,500 laptops and applications to go on Microsoft Teams in less than 3 weeks to our workforce. But interestingly, who would have thought we'd have got the states on an online states meeting? It was challenging, to say the least. But who would have thought, when we had states members, understandably, and I'm not making judgment, struggle with technology and the use of technology and wanted hard copy papers. But actually, I think people have seen how fantastic my dear old mum and my mother-in-law have been separated from their families. We just ordered small devices online, sent them out so that we could hook up between our houses and the family. And I'm sure you guys were the same. You know, we were playing family quiz games online on a Friday night. Everyone had their drink and they were saying hello to each other. It's fantastic. And I think we've managed to adopt that thinking and that art of the possible into the what, and probably being dragged behind by the laggards, which is probably some of our older generations in the workplace wanted to continue working just as we always have. And I think that is another key bit, Elaine, I would say, that you know, that I've seen from this crisis.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I think there is and as with most of these things, there's the positives and the negatives, isn't there?
Yeah.
And that is a real positive that came out of it, and we had the same experience. I think the flip side, and this is not just COVID related, but the culture of presenteeism has shifted in a sense from being behind the desk to being at the device. And we find that actually one of our, and it's a real struggle and a real challenge. I'm a workaholic, you know, I get up at 4 or 5 and I work through till midnight, whatever, it doesn't bother me. But I don't say it's necessarily a healthy way to live. And what I certainly don't want is my team to think that they need to do 18 hours or they're not going to be promoted or they're not going to be rewarded or recognised. But one of the difficulties we have is that, particularly given that we live in such an international workspace, time differences and such, like the expectation from clients is that you will be available. And actually one of the things I struggled with COVID was that everybody on our sign off, you've got your mobile number, and that meant that I was getting WhatsApp messages from all sorts of people that ordinarily, in the nicest possible way, they would never contact me except via my office email or the office phone. And there was no escape. You know, there really was no escape from it. And I think one of our real worries, is how do we stop people, or how do we manage those expectations? And I know, for example, in France, there are various employers who've taken the initiative, and indeed they're in some respects, I think it's either guidance or regulations or even a part of the legal regime now, that thou shalt not do after certain periods of time. It's a bit like a change, the working time regulations that we saw in the UK, it's shifting that into the kind of electronic digital space for workers. And I don't think there are easy answers to that, because particularly just now when the economy's turning down, there's a real pressure on people to work as long as they can and on companies to be productive.
Absolutely. Laura, do you have any comments that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think personally, looking at our own workforce, it's very, very dependent on the individual, actually. And we had some individuals who were itching to get back to the workplace and itching to get back to that 9 to 5 that they knew and loved. And then we had other individuals who have a completely different life setup, and actually 9 to 5 doesn't work for them. They want to be logging on at 7 and then taking a longer lunch break or logging on in the evening instead. And I think it goes again to that trust element of, if you can just trust your workforce to get the job done, then you can actually improve their well-being by shifting away from that 9 to 5 if you need to, for benefiting them in the long run. So I do think kind of potentially there is an end to the 9 to 5 culture, but a lot of that is yet to be seen.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is going to be incredibly interesting to see, particularly in the private sector, what happens over the next sort of 6, 12, 18 months, because I think the recessionary period that we've now entered, we don't know the length or depth of that. And because we're such an interconnected economy, to some extent, we are reliant on the rest of the world doing okay so that we can benefit from that. Yes, I harbour the hope that organisations across all sectors will do whatever they can to support their workforce in whatever shape or size that looks like, I just hope that they are acutely aware of the well-being, the sort of how fragile somebody's well-being is as we sort of hit the track running again back into 6th gear to try to do all we can to speed up that recovery period. Right, I'm afraid we are out of time. So huge thank you to our three panellists. This will be circulated, as David alluded, across our various networks, and of course you're free to use it as you wish, but huge thank you. And we hopefully look forward to involving you again in future webinars. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Apologies for the coughing.